Thanks, everyone, for coming. We're going to get started now. My name's Jason Bordoff, professor here at the School of International Public Affairs and director of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Really am delighted to kick off the new year and the new semester with this presentation by Mark Finley from BP, General Manager, Global Energy Markets and U.S. Economics. So he does the economic analysis for BP that goes into their energy outlook and their statistical review. When I was in government, Mark was a great friend and a great resource to get good analysis and talk through energy market issues with, and I'm really excited that he's here now. I won't walk through his whole bio. He's Vice President of the International Association of Energy Economics, Chairman of the U.S. Conference of Business Economists, 25 years of experience, both private and public sector, as an energy economist. So he's really one of the leading thinkers in the space as an energy economist, and I'm really excited that he's here today to share with us BP's take on what the energy outlook is, which is, given how rapidly changing the global energy landscape is, I'm excited to hear. So please, Mark.
Jason, thank you for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on such a cold night, and I'd especially like to welcome the students who are in the audience, and thank you for your interest in pursuing studies and potentially careers in the energy field. Wasn't my intention when I was in graduate school, fell into it by accident, but it's been a fabulous career, and I highly recommend it. My remarks will be based on presenting BP's annual long-term world energy outlook. It's an annual effort for us, and it's a complement to the annual statistical review of a world energy. Some of you may be familiar with that from your coursework or from your professional work. BP has published a statistical review of world energy for 62 years. It's the first publication that comes out with historical data for the comprehensive data for all forms of energy for all countries the previous year. It comes out each June, and the focus of the statistical review has always been to be objective and to get the best publicly available objective information and then to collate it and make it publicly available. We try to keep that mindset when we put the energy outlook together. And what I mean by that in particular is two things. First, it stands on the base of the data from the statistical review. So everything that's in here is consistent with the current edition of the statistical review in terms of its historical data. But secondly, and I would argue more importantly, we try to be as objective as we can be. And so we try to put together an outlook that represents our best effort to articulate what we think is the most likely trajectory for the world's energy system over the next, in this case, 23 years. And we'll do that not only trying to anticipate how economic growth might progress and how technology might evolve, and we'll see some examples of that, but also how policy is most likely to evolve. And I think that's an important differentiating aspect of our outlook. And we know that anytime you put one number down on the page regarding the future, the only thing you can say for sure about it is that it's going to be wrong. But really, it's less about the specific numbers and more about the trends and the uncertainties, the decision points, the forks in the road, the opportunities for business leaders and government leaders to affect these dynamics through the choices that they make. So this year, we've built our outlook around three themes. We asked ourselves, can the world have sufficient energy to meet projected economic growth expectations? Can that energy be secure, and can it be sustainable? So sufficient, secure, sustainable. We'll work our way through those different themes as we go through the presentation. And I'm going to apologize in advance. The base presentation, when it was published in London, was an hour long, and I really don't want to inflict an hour-long presentation on you all. I want to make sure I leave lots of time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to try to look for places where I can shave it back, and we can bring out some more of that detail in the discussion. We'll begin by reviewing some of the high-level trends from the global aggregate. and then we'll go through the dynamics fuel by fuel. We'll focus first on oil and other liquid fuels, and then we'll look at natural gas, other forms of energy, and then we're going to step back and look in more depth at CO2 emissions, and we're going to kind of decompose those and see what insights we can gain by thinking about it through some different lenses. So first, global energy trends. I'm first going to show you 3 slides in a row that will show you the exact same data sliced different ways for perspective. So what I'm showing you here is our history and our projections for global energy demand. By the way, we convert all forms of energy into the equivalent of a ton of oil so that we can make comparisons between fuels. So here I'm showing you the projections and the history based on country and key regions of the world. The headline number is that we expect global energy demand to grow by, in aggregate, 41% by 2035. That's a growth rate of about 1.5% per year, slightly slower than we've seen over the last 20 to 25 years. Almost all of that growth, 95% of it, is in the emerging economies. And you can see that we've broken out China and India in particular here. On the right-hand side, we're showing you growth increments by region or country and by decade. And the key point here is this. We are now, today, in the strong period of global energy demand growth. In our outlook, the growth of energy demand growth slows successively by decade as we go further out. And you can see, in fact, that the biggest source of that slowdown is China. And we'll go through this and we'll see some examples of it as we go through. We believe that China will reach a point where the mode of economic development will begin to shift from energy-intensive export-led growth to less energy-intensive domestic consumption of goods and services. It's also important, by the way, we feel, to recognize that China's experience in the last 20 years of rapid energy-intensive economic and energy development is not necessarily the template either for other countries historically or for what we see going forward. So while other countries do begin to grow more rapidly, in fact, India surpasses China as the leading source of energy demand growth in our outlook toward the end of the period, we do not see that particular form of very energy-intensive economic development being replicated elsewhere around the world. The next lens is to slice the energy demand by sector of the economy. And so I'm showing you the same data here, and again, breaking it out by final consumption. So industrial applications, transportation, and other, which is primarily residential and commercial heating, electricity, as well as agriculture. The most rapid growth of final energy demand in our outlook is for the industrial sector. And you'll notice, by the way, that the industry and the other have actually 2 slices to them. One is primary energy consumed directly in those sectors. By primary energy, by the way, we mean the original sources of the energy molecule. It's whether it's renewable forms of energy, nuclear, hydro, or fossil fuels. But we also have taken that primary energy as it's consumed in power generation and distributed the power demand into these final sectors. So you see the power share, which is actually the key driver, and we'll come back to that theme. If you have an electron microscope, you'll see that there is some electricity in transportation, but not very much. We'll come back to that as well. Actually, transport overall is the slowest growing sector in our outlook. And again, on the sectoral basis, on the 10-year increments, you can see that much of the slowdown of energy consumption growth in the later years of our forecast is, again, in the industrial sector, again, primarily driven by the China dynamic that we discussed earlier. The final lens for looking at energy consumption is to break it out fuel by fuel. And so we show you all of the data again here. In our outlook, every form of energy grows. The fastest growing group of fuels by far are at the top of that chart, renewable forms of energy, which grow by about 6.5% per year. That is to say, more than 4 times faster than the rest of the energy complex, albeit from a relatively small base. Among the fossil fuels, natural gas is the fastest growing fuel and the only fossil fuel that actually gains market share in our outlook. And the slowest growing fuel in our outlook is oil. Now you can see, however, that the trajectory of fuels, again, changes significantly over time, and that much of the slowdown in the growth of energy demand in the later years of our outlook is again in coal, again driven by the China dynamic. There's also another dynamic at play here, however, and that is, I remember I mentioned that we believe that we try to forecast how policy is likely to evolve. We do believe that over time, countries, especially led by the mature industrial economies of the OECD, will begin to adopt policies aimed at dealing with the challenge of climate. And again, we can come back to that in the discussion if you like. So that was demand. Now, as an economist, I can't just leave it at that. I've got to tell about the supply side as well. So this chart takes the energy supply dimensions of our outlook. Here we slice it by region of the world. Personally, when I put this chart together, I was surprised to see that Asia is today the biggest source of energy production in the world. Not surprising, I guess, when you reflect on it, it's primarily driven by coal, especially in China. But that's not what drives growth going in the future. In fact, Asia accounts for the biggest, almost half, in fact, of all of the growth of energy production in the world in our outlook. And it's not primarily driven by coal, especially in the later years of our outlook, as we will see. All regions of the world grow their energy production, with the exception of Europe. In our data, North America is the second biggest energy-producing region in the world and remains that through the outlook. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned earlier that one of our questions was, can the world have sufficient energy to fuel continued economic growth? Our answer is an emphatic yes. One of the reasons for that is shown on the right-hand side, in which we're showing new forms of energy production. And here we're including, just for the sake of argument, unconventional sources of oil production, shale gas production, and growth of renewable forms of energy. These three sources of energy alone account for almost half of all of the growth of the world's energy production in our outlook. So again, one of the reasons why we believe that we're optimistic that the world can have the energy it needs, is that new forms of energy are coming on the scene in a material way, driven by innovation, competition, but also by supportive policy environments. Whether that is investment in the shale side or climate and other policy initiatives to support the continued rapid development of renewable forms of energy. So another reason why we're optimistic that the world can have the energy it needs to fuel economic growth is that we don't need the energy. The world becomes much more efficient. And that's what I'm showing you on the left-hand side. Here we're showing you the progression over history and in our forecast for the world's economy and the world's energy demand. I already mentioned that energy grows by 41% in our outlook. The world's economy more than doubles. When we back that out and think of it in terms of how much energy is needed to produce a given unit of economic activity, in our outlook it improves by 36%, slightly faster than what we've seen in the recent past, driven by the higher energy prices we've seen in recent years, and again, expectations that policy will continue to evolve to drive this. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the evolution of market shares. Oil today, by the way, does it come through? I have a little light gray line that denotes history in the forecast in general. Oil for today is still the dominant fuel in the world, but it's been losing market share structurally for 40 years. In fact, here's the quiz for the students in the audience. What year did oil's market share peak globally? 1973, the year of the Arab oil embargo. Oil prices went up. Oil has done nothing but lose market share ever since. And in our outlook, you can see it continues to do so. What gains market share? For a few years, it's coal, but then that dynamic I talked about kicks in. Coal begins to lose market share. Gas continues to gain. What's interesting is that for the first time in modern economic history, the world will not have a single new dominant source of energy. In fact, since the dawn of the industrial era, what we've seen is one fuel will briefly pass another, but we've never seen three altogether. So we've seen kind of wood give up its leadership to coal, coal give up its leadership to oil. We've never seen this before, where three different fuels are all kind of vying for leadership around the world. Personally, and I'll leave it to some of you in the room to develop this theme, I think it poses some interesting geopolitical questions. What does it mean if the world doesn't have a dominant fuel? And again, you see the dramatic growth of renewables. Renewables on our data will pass nuclear energy in market share and roughly equilibrate with hydro power globally by 2035. But what it means is that, as you can see, even though renewables are by far the fastest growing fuel, the world is still heavily dominated by fossil fuels in our outlook. Fossil fuels lose market share, but they still account for 80% of the global total, even by 2035. I mentioned earlier that power is a key driver of this dynamic. What I'm showing you on the left-hand side is that this is one of the most well-established trends in all of energy, that power becomes more important in the overall energy mix over time. And that continues in our outlook. And by the way, it's not only a story for emerging economies. Here, I'm sure you all know it in your own daily life. You know, every time we look, there's more energy being used as a share of the total to generate electricity here in the mature market economies as well. That continues in our outlook. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you how fuels have evolved in their use to generate electricity. I mentioned earlier that oil has been losing market share structurally. I think a lot of people don't realize that 40 years ago, a quarter of U.S. and global electricity was generated using oil. Today, it's nothing. You know, where oil faces competition, oil lost 40 years ago. What happens in our outlook going forward? Well, coal begins to lose market share, and most especially begins to lose market share very significantly to renewable forms of energy in the later years of our outlook. Renewables as a share of global power generation are above 10% by 2035 in our outlook, and much higher in the United States and especially in Europe. We'll come back to that concept. We can also use our data to make projections on what we call trade. It's not really trade because I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I have time to forecast actual individual bilateral trading relationships for every country and every fuel. But what I do is I take regional totals of oil and gas production and coal, net out those regional imbalances, and summarize them here. So it's a stylized representation of trade. But what we can see is that a couple of things. Below the line means that you're an importing region. Above the line means you're an exporter. Global energy trade grows, although perhaps not as rapidly as it may have in the past. One of the reasons why it doesn't grow on this basis is because North America changes sides. North America goes from being a net energy importer to net exporter. And we'll come back to that theme. By the way, on this slide, we're beginning to develop the other questions that I posed, the questions about energy security and also sustainability. And again, we'll weave these themes throughout as we go. All the growth in energy imports around the world come from Asia, which dominates the story here. You can see on the supply side, the Middle East doesn't really gain much market share. We'll come back to that when we talk about oil. What gains market share on the export side is the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. Russia, in our outlook, is today and remains the world's biggest energy exporter. Another thing that we can do is we pose the question about sustainability. Obviously, in our outlook, if the world is consuming 40% more energy and it's dominated by fossil fuels, our outlook is for CO2 emissions to rise. Again, this is not necessarily the world as BP wishes it to be, but again, it's our best effort to be as objective as we can be. And I have to confess that I don't get a lot of pushback when I say that in recent years we've seen climate policy fall down the policy agenda, not just here in the U.S., but in a lot of places around the world. So we see CO2 emissions growing. Not quite as fast as energy overall, because remember, renewables and natural gas are gaining market share, and oil and coal are losing it. But overall, CO2 emissions grow by about 30% compared to a 41% increase in energy. Keep that visual image in mind. Remember, we showed you a big gap opening between economic growth and energy consumption. The world's becoming a lot more efficient. We don't see a gap here. Not much of a gap opening between energy use and the carbon content of that energy. We're going to explore that in more detail later in the discussion.
Mark, you have no carbon price?
We do have a carbon price, but it's not a global price. When we first started doing this exercise years ago, we assumed that there would be a global carbon price by 2030. We don't see that in the policy framework. So we think that there will eventually be a modest carbon price in the United States and in other mature market economies, but that we'll also see a mix of market and regulatory measures aimed at dealing with the climate change. And so when I quote a carbon price, I mean a carbon price and not an implied price derived from regulatory efforts. So let me move next into the consideration of the data fuel by fuel. We begin with oil. It is still the dominant fuel in the world. I misspeak. because I'm not only talking about oil, I'm talking about all forms of liquid fuels, which include biofuels, gas and coal to liquids, et cetera. But it's really the oil market, and at least that's the way we tend to think about it. So I mentioned earlier that globally, oil is the weakest growing fuel in our outlook, but it still grows by 19 million barrels a day. In other words, between now and 2035, the world needs to add new supply equivalent to current production of the United States and Saudi Arabia combined. The way to read this chart is that here's the level of demand and supply in 2012, and then we show you the aggregate increments of change over the next 23 years. Now, some of you who've suffered through our presentations before know that BP isn't a big fan of the peak oil argument from the supply side. But peak demand? We're already there. We believe that oil demand in the United States and the other mature market economies will never get back to what it was in 2005 and will remain in a long-term structural decline. But all of that decline is offset by growth in one country, and then you add in the increments of the other emerging economies as well. We'll go through this in more detail. On the supply side, where does the supply come from to meet that growth in demand? Most of it does not come from OPEC, but rather comes from outside of OPEC, and in fact, it comes almost exclusively from unconventional sources of supply in the Western Hemisphere. And there I'm referring to tight oil in the United States, the kind of slightly broader framework for shale equivalent. Also, Canadian oil sands. If we include Brazilian deep water and biofuels, that accounts for virtually all of the net growth in non-OPEC production, more than enough to offset declines in mature provinces like the North Sea and Alaska. And then we do have growth in OPEC as well, and we'll come back to this in more detail for the purposes of this chart. I just want to flag that the reason we separate out natural gas liquids, or NGLs, these are hydrocarbons traditionally treated by our industry as a liquid fuel that are produced in association with natural gas. The reason why we separate it out is because OPEC quotas don't apply. OPEC quotas only apply to crude oil, and we'll come back to that theme shortly. So a bit more detail on demand. I break out the sectoral dimensions of it here. You can see the declines in the OECD are concentrated in the transport sector. In the emerging economies, significant growth not only in transport but also in industry. But remember earlier when I showed you the global picture, I said that on a sectoral basis, the big slowdown is due to a slowdown in industry. Not the case for oil. For oil, the slowdown in growth in the later years of our outlook is almost exclusively driven by transportation. Why not industry? It turns out that there are certain industrial processes like petrochemicals, a bit of refining, the need for asphalts for roads that form a base of industrial demand that cannot be substituted by other fuels by and large. And the real action on the in the oil demand sector is on the transport side. We have an in-depth look at transport coming up shortly, so I will leave it at that for right now. Next up is the supply side. I mentioned already we don't believe in peak oil. We believe that production outside of OPEC keeps growing. And yes, much of that growth is dominated by unconventional sources of supply, biofuels, Canadian oil sands, and tight oil. There's been a lot of discussion of that recently. Here's our projection, by the way, just for tight oil. The numbers have been staggering. And it is, in fact, one of the biggest sources of change in our outlook from last year was a significant upward revision to our global expectations, in North America in particular, for production of shale gas and for tight oil. In 2013, the United States, and we talked about this, you see it coming, the United States had the second biggest raw increment of production growth in the history of the world. Only one country has ever had a bigger annual increase in oil production, and that was in Saudi Arabia. Now, technically, the Saudis have done it 5 times, but 4 of those 5 were tapping spare capacity when there was a crisis. Only once, Saudi Arabia in 1973, was there organic growth of production that was greater than what the United States saw last year. So, I've been doing a statistical review for a long time. We've done one at BP for 62 years. We study history, and when you study history, you tend not to speak in superlatives because somebody was always better, faster, if you go back in history. But this is not. This is a superlative event. This is truly a big deal. And in fact, for 2 years in a row now, the United States has had 2 consecutive biggest increase in domestic oil production in the history of the country, going all the way back to Colonel Drake at Titusville 150 years ago. So kind of a big deal. You can see on our outlook that it continues to grow very rapidly for the near years of our outlook, and then kind of plateaus in North America. And then we see additional developments outside of North America. We can talk about the drivers of this in more detail if you're interested. Globally, it gets to about 7 million barrels a day, about 7% of the world's total. So it's a significant growth. And note the shape, rapid growth and then kind of plateauing. The reason why that's important is next. As that production grows very rapidly in the early years of our outlook, the market actually requires less oil from OPEC. We believe that in the face of that, OPEC members will cut production in an effort to support prices. What it means is that OPEC's spare capacity over the next few years in our outlook goes up to about 6 million barrels a day. That's a level that the cartel hasn't had to grapple with since the 1980s. Now, eventually, that rapid growth of tight oil in our outlook begins to slow down. OPEC then recovers market share, and OPEC's spare capacity reduces accordingly. But OPEC's market share, even as it recovers, never gets anywhere back near to where it was in the 1970s. Now, another factor that we have to take consideration of as we put an outlook together these days is the dramatic instability that we've seen in much of the world, falling under the rubric of what other people will call the Arab Spring. As much attention as we pay to the dramatic growth of domestic production in the United States, the chart on the left shows you that it has been offset nearly exactly, barrel for barrel, by an increase in supply disruptions around the world. Moreover, a review of historical instances of supply disruptions due to domestic unrest or civil war raise concern. We can see that in country after country that experienced civil unrest and big disruptions in domestic oil production, it took many years, if ever, for it to get back to where it was before. So the historical evidence would suggest that there's reason to be concerned about the potential rapid recovery of these sources of supply that have been disrupted in recent years. Now, our outlook also, I think there's some feedback loops here. When we look at the social pressures that some of these countries have been under, I think it helps to explain some of the instability that we've seen, and it's reinforcing some of the dimensions of our energy outlook. So here we've looked at just the OPEC countries and compared some key indicators with other emerging economies and with the mature market economies. So OPEC countries have seen and are likely to continue to see much more rapid growth of population. If we look at economic performance, OPEC countries as a whole have per capita GDP today no bigger than what it was in 1975. And that compares to much more rapid growth in the emerging economies and even in the industrialized countries. Another dimension is that these countries are increasingly consuming their own production. We see per capita energy consumption is the highest of any region in the world. In our outlook for per capita oil consumption, the Middle East passes the United States as some of the most energy-intensive or oil-intensive consumers in the world. And what it means is that, combined with the broader market dimensions that we have discussed, there's not a lot of headroom for growth of exports from these countries. Again, increasingly because the domestic production is going to be consumed at home. Let me move on to energy security and trade dimensions of the oil side. I'm going to focus first on the outside panels, China and the United States. And what I'm showing you here is the profile for demand and how that demand gets met over time as it evolves. In the United States, we believe the U.S. will still be a net oil importer by 2035, but it will only be importing about 1 million barrels a day, down from a peak of 12 million barrels a day in 2005. China, on the other hand, sees its import dependence grow sharply. China, if it hasn't already, will very shortly pass the U.S. as the biggest oil importing country in the world. Will also pass the United States as the biggest oil consuming country in the world in the middle years of our outlook. And by the end of our outlook, in both percent and volume terms, China's dependence on imported oil will be far greater than anything the U.S. has ever experienced. The center panel is that familiar description of global trade. Again, you can see North America as a whole switching from a net oil exporter to a net oil importer. All of the net growth in oil imports around the world are accounted for by Asia. not met by corresponding growth in exports from the Middle East, for reasons we discussed already, meaning that Asian oil importers will increasingly turn for incremental barrels to Africa, the former Soviet Union, and even Western Hemisphere producers to meet their growing demand. Now, I mentioned that we wanted to take a deeper look at transportation. Some people, we've mentioned also that transport is the weakest growing sector in our outlook. We've received challenges saying, well, how can you say people aren't going to buy cars? And that, let me be clear, is not what we're saying. Here's the data. We expect that the world's vehicle fleet will more than double. The vehicle fleet in the emerging economies will more than triple, as a matter of fact. But demand doesn't grow as rapidly. Why doesn't it grow as rapidly? Because of significant increases in fuel efficiency. As a result, we see, even with the rising vehicle fleet, energy demand in transport in the OECD falls. And while the vehicle fleet triples in the emerging economies, demand in the transport sector for energy only grows by about 80%. And here, in fact, is the narrative around the fuel efficiency. We see significant increases in fuel efficiency, not just in the United States and Europe. Look who else is on that list. Much more fuel-efficient vehicles already coming into the marketplace in China, for example. In the first instance, this is actually not driven by government standards, but rather by consumers reacting to higher prices at the pump. It's us collectively putting the Hummer brand name out of business. In the later years of our outlook, it is true that the more aggressive fuel efficiency standards become the principal driver of the efficiency gains we're sharing here. Now, every year, then the question is, well, how does that fuel efficiency get delivered? So we go out every year, we talk to the battery makers, we talk to the national laboratories, we talk to all the auto companies. Every year what comes up is that the most cost-effective way of delivering a more fuel-efficient car is to make the classic internal combustion engine more fuel-efficient, supplemented with hybrid technology. So in our outlook, you can see new car sales by 2035 are conventional internal combustion engines complemented or supplemented by hybrid technology. Not a lot of electric vehicles in there. And what shows up as plug-in and battery electric vehicles is primarily plug-in hybrids, again, because of the range issues associated with pure batteries, even over this time frame. So overall, for transport demand, I mentioned that it's growing weakly. It's the weakest sector in our outlook. Here's the data. Oil gets squeezed even more because in the later years of our outlook, oil does begin to get displaced by natural gas in transportation. This is primarily driven, by the way, by liquefied natural gas in long-distance trucking, rail, and shipping. Rather than compressed natural gas for personal vehicles because of the economics and range considerations. In the later years of our outlook, again, the familiar pattern of slowing demand, but also notice that natural gas actually replaces oil as the leading source of fuel growth in transportation in the later years of our outlook. Let me move next to natural gas, since we're already talking about it. I mentioned earlier, natural gas is the fastest growing fuel in our outlook. Here's the demand data. Unlike oil, demand does grow in the mature market economies, but 80% of the growth is still in the emerging economies. And on a sectoral basis, you can see the growth in the early years is in power generation and industrial applications, and then toward the end of the outlook, you begin to see that wedge for natural gas used in transportation also beginning to show up. On the supply side, here's the data. Again, we break it out with the mature market economies and the emerging economies, and you can see the importance of shale. In fact, shale gas dramatically grows its market share. Remember, for oil, shale was about 7% of the total. For natural gas, it's more than 20%. So, again, the key point is that shale is a much bigger deal for natural gas than it is for oil. And again, the growth trajectory is familiar, dominated by North America, even in the late years of our outlook. Unlike oil, however, you don't see that plateau that we achieved in the oil side, and you see a bigger contribution from other countries around the world. And again, we can talk more about that later if you like. So we can use this data again to do now what I hope is a familiar chart of looking at those regional imbalances. You see again the familiar pattern of Asia dominating the growth of import dependence. North America goes from basically being self-sufficient today to being a significant net exporter. We can break down the trade of natural gas into two components. First, pipeline trade, which although it grows in absolute terms, loses market share. and liquefied natural gas, which continues to expand its share of the global consumption. The reason why that's important is because those tankers give us flexibility. They allow us over time to begin to connect what are today largely disconnected regional gas markets around the world. Now, I mentioned also that we wanted to look in a bit more detail at North America. We've been conducting academic economists like to talk about real experiments. Is that the phrase? So we've been conducting a real experiment in North America with natural gas in the last decade or so. We have what is essentially an island in the world marketplace because North America is not configured to export gas elsewhere around the world. We drop a big new chunk of supply on top of it and ask, how does it adjust? How does the system work through? So let's take a look. First, what I'm showing you is North America compared to other parts of the world. It is, I love it. Only an economist could show you a chart labeled sources of supply and actually show you demand. What I'm showing you is this is the demand profile for each region, and within that demand profile, how is it met? Through a combination of domestic production of conventional production, shale gas, and then other forms of unconventional and trade. So in North America, it's dominated by the rapid growth of shale production, which will account for the majority of North American production in our outlook, and provide room for North America to become an increasingly important net exporter of natural gas. Not the same in other key gas-consuming regions. Europe, consumption grows slowly, but domestic production is declining. Not much of shale in this outlook for Europe, and we can talk about that if you like. But what it means is that import dependence grows in Europe to meet that growing demand. And then we have China on the right, which by 2035 will be consuming about what Europe does. China has the biggest incremental growth of gas demand in our outlook. And to meet that, we see significant growth of domestic production, including shale and other unconventionals, but also rapid growth of traded natural gas as well, importing more gas as well. So I mentioned the real-world experiment that we've been conducting here in the United States in the last decade. So again, here's the thought experiment. You have a disconnected marketplace that's relatively stable. You drop a massive new source of supply in it through the technological innovation that is shale. What happens? Well, first thing that happens is what we've seen. Natural gas prices collapse. You have record discounts of natural gas to oil prices. So here's a question. If you owned a drilling rig in the last couple of years and you had a choice of looking for oil or gas, which would you look for? Well, the U.S. oil and gas industry has voted with its feet over the last decade. 10 years ago, 75% of the rigs were looking for natural gas. Today, 75% of the rigs are looking for oil. So there's one response. Second response, you've got all this supply sloshing around. It's got to go somewhere. Where can it go? In the very short term, there's only one place where that gas can go into the U.S. economy. Power generation. That's where the fleet of power generating plants are that have flexibility to shut down the coal plant, turn on the gas plant. So what we've seen is a dramatic ramp up of gas in power generation already taking place. If you have prices cheap enough for long enough, people begin to invest in building new industrial capacity to build that out. And over time, we even see it beginning to come into the transport sector as well, although the investment chain is much more complicated there because you've got to work through the whole supply chain and refueling infrastructure, as well as the actual final point of consumption, that is to say, a car or truck. So you've got a supply reaction, you've got a demand reaction, and as you know, you have a trade reaction. The U.S. doesn't export natural gas today. Well, it doesn't export it outside of North America. But guess what? A number of permits have been given to build new liquefied natural gas export terminals, not only in the United States, but we believe that will in Canada as well. And so we see the growth of natural gas exports from the United States indicated here. And in fact, the United States actually becomes, on our data now, the second biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world in our outlook. Another point to look at on the diversification of sources of liquefied natural gas supply in the world. Today, the number one supplier in the world has a 33% market share. Going forward, you can see a much more diverse slate of suppliers coming into the market. And I think that, again, there are some interesting strategic and geopolitical consequences of a much less concentrated supply network for the world's LNG market. Next up is coal. We've already talked about coal in the aggregate. here's the data for consumption going forward. And again, you see that China continues its dramatic ramp up for a few years and then begins to level off. We do see more rapid growth in India and elsewhere in the emerging economies, but not on the pace and scale that we've seen over the last couple of decades in China. But again, the last couple of decades of China are really what has been the historical outlier when we look more broadly at the data. You can see the dramatic slowdown concentrated in China. In fact, in the last 10 years of our outlook, there is no growth of coal consumption in China. Between the slowdown of demand and a more diverse slate of power generation coming in, more nuclear, more renewables, more natural gas, we find that, again, coal consumption growth actually stops in China. Other forms of non-fossil energy are recorded here, and here we break it out between the emerging economies and the mature market economies. Globally, nuclear power has been losing market share. You can see it here. One of the benefits of extending our outlook to 2035 is that now you see a drop-off at the backside, too. That's primarily driven by a view that we've developed that here in the United States, nuclear power plants will begin to reach the end of their safe operating lives and begin to be decommissioned in the later years of our outlook. But globally, nuclear continues to grow. We don't see any sign that the tragedy at Fukushima has impacted plans for developing nuclear power in China, India, Russia, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, I mentioned earlier that renewables have been growing rapidly. Here we break out biofuels and renewables in power generation, and you can see that the real action is in renewables in power generation. We've seen a favorable policy environment, even with budget realities, frankly, coming into play. We've also seen substantial reductions in costs for the production of wind turbines, for example, that leave wind already competitive today in some applications. And over time, with more stringent air quality and the adoption of climate policies and continued cost savings, we see wind growing very rapidly. And in the later years of our outlook, significant potential for cost savings in developing next generation of solar cells. And so there's rapid growth there as well. And by the way, it is no longer only the province of the mature, rich OECD countries to do that. So, and again, we mentioned the rapid growth of renewables and power generation, with a very aggressive policy fostering its development. We see the most significant penetration in Europe. But, significant growth of renewables and power generation in the United States, getting up to nearly 20% of power generation by 2035, and rapid growth in China. And if we look at the sheer increment of growth of power output from renewables, the biggest increment in the world, actually, is from China in our outlook. So one of the reasons why the European share grows so rapidly is because their overall demand isn't growing. So I mentioned earlier we wanted to take a deeper look at carbon. I also mentioned earlier that our outlook is for carbon emissions to continue to rise. Here's the data. All of the increase is in the emerging economies. CO2 emissions in our outlook in the United States and in Europe continue to decline. But that's more than offset by the dramatic growth in the emerging economies. And we've put in for reference the trajectory that the climate scientists have said is needed for the world to get on a trajectory towards stabilizing atmospheric concentrations at 450 parts per million. Manifestly, we are not there. Again, not a world necessarily that we wish to have happen, but what we objectively think is the trend line. We can see, and again, if we look at emissions on a per capita basis, you see the dramatic growth of China surpassing Europe in the early years of our outlook, although, of course, remaining well below per capita emissions in the United States. Now, we can decompose carbon emissions. If you think about it, there's really two threads here. One is, how much energy do you use relative to your economy? And the other is, how much carbon do you use relative to your energy? So I'm showing you those two components here, and we're going to break them out separately. On the left, I'm showing you the trends in energy efficiency. That is the relationship between energy and economic growth. We already talked about this. Some of you have seen this chart, in fact, in previous iterations of this presentation. A few things to note. A, the world is getting significantly more efficient over time, and I mentioned earlier we see a 36% improvement in our outlook, but also the gap between different countries, how different countries use energy relative to their economy, is dramatically homogenizing. The world has never looked as similar as it does today in how different countries consume energy relative to their economic activity, and that continues to converge over time. Why does it converge? Because energy markets are global. There's global prices. There's trade. There's globalization of trade in goods and services and the energy that's used to do it. And all of that drives things to look more similar. The punchline that my boss used recently was, not only do our kids watch the same TV shows, here and around the world, they watch it from from TV sets that draw the same sources of power increasingly. That is not the case if we look at the carbon content of the world's energy mix. Two things to note. One, not much improvement. There's a little bit. It improves by 8%, with the growing use of renewables and gas and coal and oil losing market share, but also no convergence. There is no force out there today forcing countries around the world to converge in the way they use carbon relative to their overall energy mix. There's no price of carbon. There's no market and trading, writ large, to drive that homogenization that we're seeing on the other side. And we can develop that idea a bit further. This is a rather busy chart, but let me help you work through it. What we're showing you here is going back over 100 years, 20 major economies, how they've used energy. And what I'm showing you is the concentration of the most dominant fuel in that country's energy mix. So 100 years, 113 years ago, 14 years ago, everybody used coal as the dominant fuel, and it was virtually the only fuel out there. Over time, you can see a couple things happening. You see a general downward trend. That means that the dominant fuel is no longer, there's more diversity of supply between different sources of energy. But you see the colors changing too. All of a sudden, we start to see oil. We start to see other forms, hydroelectricity, natural gas, creeping in as the dominant source of energy. So it's going down and the colors are shifting. In our outlook, in the United States, natural gas becomes the dominant fuel. In Europe, non-fossil forms of energy as a group become the dominant source of energy. But you see that pattern happening over time, but it's slowly happening. And certainly this lightening of the carbon load that's implied from this is not driven in the first instance by carbon policies. One of the ways that we see this dynamic playing out is the competition in power generation, and we've touched on this already. I won't belabor the point other than to say, remember I talked about in the absence of a carbon price, countries are going to use what they have. China is dominant in coal, and although coal loses market share, it still remains the dominant fuel. The one exception, by the way, to coal losing market share around the world is outside of China and India, emerging Asia. And the reason is simple. If you're hitting that track of development, you're working hard to develop your economy, you're going to use what you have handy. And in the absence of climate policy, what they have handy is coal. So this is the one part of the world where we think coal will actually gain market share. So we can bring all this together. I've shown you the visual image on the left in different places. Now I'm putting it in one picture. Big gap opens between the economy and energy. No gap opens between energy and CO2 in the carbon mix. And the reason is there's a real incentive to do this because energy is expensive, and there's not much of an incentive to do this because carbon is not expensive by and large around the world. So if the world didn't change its relationship between energy and economic activity and the carbon mix, if nothing changed and we just had economic growth forever, CO2 emissions by 2035 would be an extra 32 billion tons a year. In actual practice, we see CO2 emissions growing, but they only grow by 10 billion tons a year. The biggest source of that savings is the dramatic increase of energy intensity or improvement of energy efficiency. So here's the thing. We think this represents low-hanging fruit. We've seen the dramatic improvements that can be registered when energy becomes expensive relative to economic activity. That experience suggests to us that if carbon were to become expensive, there could be significant low-hanging fruit to realize on that dimension of the bar as well. So as policymakers and decision makers, as we think about how to tackle the climate challenge, it looks to us like that could be the low-hanging fruit. So let me wrap up. By the way, I saw someone trying to take a picture. I'm happy. This is all available online if you want to download it and save yourself the effort. So can energy be sufficient? We think yes, because we see new sources of energy coming in and because we see the world not using as much energy relative to the economy because of greater efficiency gains. Can energy be secure? Certainly good news on that front from the United States perspective. From a classical energy security perspective, maybe sources of concern in places like developing economies in Asia. Although I would note that we've seen the example of the benefit of energy import dependence in the last couple of years. Play a thought game with me. If Japan had been an island of energy security, had been disconnected from the rest of the world, what would the economic impact of the tragedy at Fukushima have been if Japan had not been able to be import dependent and to tap into global markets to import more other sources of energy to offset the closure of the nuclear power plants? And sustainability, manifestly not on a sustainable trajectory, at least in the dimension of CO2 emissions. There is some positive news here in the United States and Europe in that we expect emissions to go down, but it's a global problem, and globally emissions are going up. However, for these last two dimensions, for both security and sustainability, I think the objective review of the data shows that market forces can be a powerful ally in tackling these challenges. And I will leave it at that for this purpose so we can have more, hopefully I've left time for discussion. And again, all of this is available online if you want to download it. Thank you again for your time and attention. For those of you who are students, good luck with your studies, and we'll look forward to seeing you, in energy circles down the road. Thank you again.